And so we have quite a day filled with activities for you today. Of course, we have Feynman's van, thanks to Seamus Blackey here, who I will introduce a little bit more later, and the restoration of the van, and Leonard Mlodinow and Michelle Feynman. So let me just say a few words about that. And also our next event is Sunday, Sunday 2 o'clock, January 24th, Arthur Benjamin, the lightning calculator. He's a mathematician. So bring your calculators, and he will do actually what your father was really good at doing, which is race people in their calculators, and he will pretty much beat you most of the time. But it's a good test to see if your calculators are working properly. Anyway, and then after that, I'm still working on booking the rest of the winter and spring for our events here. And then, so briefly speaking, the impetus for this is the new book, The Quotable Feynman, edited by Richard's daughter Michelle Feynman, who is also the editors of his papers and Perfectly Reasonable Deviations from the Beaten Track. That's a nice title for the letters of Richard P. Feynman. And The Art of Richard P. Feynman, Images by a Curious Character, three of which you can see right here that Richard drew. In part, nearby there's a good Altadena connection here. Michelle lives in Altadena. I live 5 doors down. And Feynman did his drawings at Jerry Zorathian's ranch, which is up in Altadena. If you go to the top of Lincoln, and then just keep going past that, there's like a kids camp there, and then keep going up this bad road that it really takes like a mountain bike to get up this thing, and then keep going up the dirt, and then you end up in this sort of 60s compound that hasn't changed much since the 60s. Anyway, it's a great place to go. So that's, I guess, where they did some of these like that. And then, before we get into it, and then our other guest, Leonard Mlodinow. Len's a longtime friend. He's spoken for the Skeptics many times, but he's the author of Feynman's Rainbow, which is a beautiful book, A Search for Beauty in Physics and Life. He also authored The Grand Design with Stephen Hawking and The War of the Worldviews with Deepak Chopra. There's sort of a nice contrast there. Yeah. Stephen Hawking, a wide-ranging character himself. His new book is The Upright Thinkers, The Human Journey from Living in Trees to Understanding the Cosmos, which just got named in the Wall Street Journal as one of the top books of 2015 by none other than the Koch brothers. I forget which one, but I sent it to Len and he went, oh no.
I have such a wide variety.
Yes. So we had Stephen Hawking, Deepak Chopra, and the Koch brothers. Oh boy. And, sorry. Also call your attention to, you should pick up a copy of a very old issue of Skeptic magazine with Feynman on the cover. We did a special issue on genius. And the cover was done by Pat Lindsay, my partner who's been greeting people out there, who does all the artwork, layout, design for Skeptic magazine. So Michelle, just tell us, to get us started, why this book right now? How did you come about to put this together?
Well, I've always enjoyed quotes, not just my father's, but growing up, and working on his book. Certainly the letters book was a great chance to read letters that maybe didn't make the book, but I thought, oh, I really love that. Those few sentences are fantastic. And I was kind of thinking, what could we do with those? And then the publisher approached us with this idea, and they had done the Quotable Einstein, and so we felt like that was the right place and the right thing to do.
There must be thousands to pick from.
Yeah.
He's a very quotable character.
Right. And that was hard. I mean, when I said I would do it, I thought, sure. That's a couple months, right?
We know what that's like.
We know what that's like.
It's crazy.
When the deadline is a year from now, oh, sure.
And I really just had to kind of rip it out of my hands. Like I could still be working on it.
Right.
Very happily, still working on it. And it's fun to work on. I hear his voice when I read his words, and it's kind of like spending time with him. And I think sometimes you read certain things and it doesn't really hit you until maybe you've experienced other. It's sort of it feels like the conversation is evolving.
Right.
So it's I could have actually.
And congratulations on you got Alan Alda and Christopher Sykes and Danny Hillis to blurb it, and Yo-Yo Ma to write a foreword.
Whoa.
Yeah. And Brian Cox to write an introduction. Brian's opens up nicely here with a story about asking physics students who they would most like to be like. And, Einstein was second and Feynman was first. So that's pretty cool. In fact, just yesterday I was listening to Sam Harris's latest podcast with David Deutsch, who wrote that book, The Edge of Infinity, about physics and so on. And as a throwaway line at the very end, after an hour and a half of a long conversation about the philosophy of science, he says, by the way, I'm just thinking about doing this new little project where I'll ask my guests, who's the smartest person who ever lived? Not the most influential, like Hitler or something, but just raw intelligence, and expecting somebody to say Einstein or whatever. Deutsch goes, unquestionably, Richard Feynman. Yeah, smartest person who ever lived. Well, okay, so...
and Deutsch just met them all, right?
All the way back to Socrates, right? Well, but he had a funny story, which links into a lot of the quotes you have here from people that he met Feynman once when he was young, when David was young, and he was working on some project and some conference. And Feynman said, "So what are you working on?" So he says, 2 sentences into it, Feynman says, "Stop. Now let me see if I can figure out what it is you're doing," and proceeds to tell Deutsch everything he's concluding before he even said what exactly it is he was working on. Oh, okay. And apparently that was a common.
Common. I think there's a story where somebody was working on something quite hard, and he told my father a little bit about it, and a physics problem, and he went home and kind of cranked the night away, came back and said, okay, so here's what I'm thinking, and like caught up to where he was at that moment. And the guy said, it's taken me 6 months, like you did that and stop right here in one night, So
humbling,
yes.
Or maybe frustrating.
Perhaps.
Leonard, how did you meet Feynman?
Well, how I met him was when I got a job at Caltech, and I had recently graduated, got my PhD, and that was my first job in physics. And I guess, as is still true today, Feynman was, of course, the idol of all physics students. And here I find out that my office is going to be 2 doors down from him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What year was this?
Oh, it was like last year.
Yeah.
Can't you tell? It was like 1981, I think.
Okay, yeah.
And how I first met him was I think I just got the courage to go knock on his door, and it was really surprising to me that it was that easy, to go in to see someone like Feynman. I mean, at Berkeley, I had interacted with Nobel Prize winners, but he was thought of by us as, and on a higher level, as I'm sure his progeny is also. And so, it was a little, I was very nervous, but it was just, you just walk in like he's a normal person. And so I just walked in and said hello.
And he was encouraging of your work or whatever you were working on?
He was a big influence on me, which is why I wrote Feynman's Rainbow about our interactions and how that changed me. But with regard to what you were just talking about, I had that similar experience where I went into him once. I was working on a theory where it was the interaction of light in materials. And there was a macroscopic theory, quantum theory, which means that it ignores the individual atoms, and there's an effective theory of how light interacts in materials. And I had an idea of how to derive that from a microscopic model based on some work, my PhD work. So I started to do that, and I got the wrong answer. It didn't match what was the published paper. So I went into Feynman and I go, you got to help me with, or I didn't say, you got to help me with this. I said, can you? And I was not aware that he had done much in quantum optics, which is that field. And but he of course knew the whole. He understood everything right away, things that I had taken a long time to figure out. And he told me something that was very useful to me. He said, why do you think that the other guy's right and you're wrong? And I'm thinking, well, because he's some famous physicist at Harvard, and this theory's been around for 15 years, and I'm a newbie, you know what I mean? Yeah. And he said, well, did you derive the theory yourself, his theory, or you just read his paper? And I said, no, of course I just read his paper, because only Feynman would not, if he was reading something, he would rederive what was in it. He wouldn't just read it. And he recommended that for all of us, but of course, for most of us, that's impossible, because you would never get past a couple papers, a year. So anyway, I went back and did that and worked on it, found out the guy was wrong, and ended up publishing a paper showing that this guy was wrong. So that was a very useful tip, which is to believe in yourself and be skeptical, which is fitting for us being here, isn't it, Michael?
Absolutely, yeah. Let me just remind everybody of the general chronology. Feynman was born in 1918, May 11th, 1918. He graduated from MIT in 1939, so at just 21 years old, from a 4-year graduate program in physics at MIT at 21. That's pretty good. PhD in 1942, and then worked on the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos 43 to 45. And then professor of physics at Caltech in 1950, as early as 1950, and he was there pretty much for the duration, except for, I guess, some touring, visiting professorships here and there. He married your mom in 1960. Son Carl was born in 62. Daughter Michelle was born in 68. He won the Nobel Prize in 1965, was also elected. I didn't even know that you could do this. You could be a foreign member of the Royal Society. So that's pretty cool. And then famously served as on the Presidential Council to determine the cause of the Challenger explosion in 1985. And then published Surely You're Joking. I have a first edition that we have in our library right there in 1985. Spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. We were just kibitzing in the green room about how fickle the publishing world is. It's just a complete crapshoot about what's going to become a bestseller or not. You just never know. And with the hindsight bias, the Freakonomics, that's the most brilliant. That had to be the dumbest name anybody ever thought of until it became the most brilliant name. And like, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Who's this guy? What?
Yeah.
Why that? It's practically a paranormal mystery how a book becomes a bestseller. But it did, and carried there for 14 weeks, and then the follow-up on that. What do you care what other people think? These stories that he told. Mostly to Ralph Layton,
yes.
I guess, are now quite amusing. And you always wonder when you're reading them, does this really happen? To what extent do you sort of exaggerate a little bit, or you put some color in? But your dad also seemed to have a commitment to detail and a great memory.
Yeah.
So I tend to take them on face value. That pretty much happened the way he said.
Right.
They did.
He was a bit of a showman. And he liked sort of theatrics, but I'm going to say just knowing his integrity, that they were true. I think there's very little exaggeration, if any, in the stories.
And one of the famous stories is walking with his dad with the little red wagon, and there's a ball in the wagon, and you pull the wagon, and the ball it rolls. It looks like it's rolling backwards, but it's really just staying in the same place, except for a little bit of friction. And that sort of gives him the impetus to think about the laws of physics and all that. And that was a pretty young age. So to what extent do you think that parents can influence their children just from those kinds of little experiences with their kids, telling them a little story like that?
I think his father was tremendously influential. Before my father was born, my grandfather announced to his wife, if he's a boy, he's going to be a scientist. Now you have to understand this was a different time.
Yes.
But as luck would have it, my father also has a sister who is also a physicist. So it turns out they were both scientists. But
their parents weren't scientists. They were.
No, and that's kind of the remarkable thing, that without kind of a sense of, without real sort of pedagogy or technique, or really much knowledge of science himself, his father was able to show him kind of the best part of science. Maybe not, knowing all the terms for things, but just kind of investigating and observing, and that was kind of more important than, you can find the other stuff out later, and I think there's a story where my father went in to talk to some biology students, and he wanted to make some point, and he looked at the chart, and they all said, well, we know that, we've taken the last 2 years and we've learned all that. And he said, well, I looked it up in 5 minutes, and now we can talk about the problem. And the idea of, I think his point was, it really, he learned, one of the quotes in here that I love is, I learned very early the difference between, wait, let me make sure I don't get it wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's not it. The difference, yeah, there it is. I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something.
Right.
And I think that...
You don't understand it just by knowing the name.
Right. And so his father gave him the tools, the skills, the kind of mindset, if you will, to learn how to further, but to be curious about the world.
Yeah.
So I think his father was hugely influential. And then I have a quote about his mother, who was also pretty great. And she actually, she said, okay, so he said about his mother, although my mother didn't know anything about science, she had a great influence on me as well. In particular, she had a wonderful sense of humor, and I learned from her that the highest forms of understanding we can achieve are laughter and human compassion.
Beautiful. Nice. Well, one of the interests we had in putting this issue together is where does creativity and genius come from? Obviously, there must be some genetics involved, which makes you and your brother super smart. And then the stories about the parent, the father telling him stories that inspired him to go into science. Len's next book is on creativity and where ideas come from and genius and that sort of thing. And in the James Glick biography, which I still think is the best biography of your dad done, he talks about, I forget the name of the mathematician that made this analogy between being a genius, which is somebody...
Oh, wait, I have that quote.
You have the quote.
I have the quote.
Yeah, read us that quote.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
the magician and the...
It's a good, all right. Mark Keck.
Mark,
okay,
yeah.
good. In science, as well as in other fields of human endeavor, there are two kinds of geniuses, the ordinary and the magicians. An ordinary genius is a fellow that you and I would be just as good as if we were only many times better. There is no mystery as to how his mind works. Once we understand what he has done, we feel certain that we too could have done it. It is different with the magicians. Even after we understand what they have done, it is completely dark. Richard Feynman is a magician of the highest caliber.
So the question is that true?
Well, that's actually interesting because in my interactions with him, I remember him saying somewhat the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
He's always said that people think that if you're a physicist, I suppose because you use mathematics, that what you're doing is difficult to understand and only for geniuses. And he would say that he believed very much that it's the same kind of thinking that ordinary people do in everyday life, whatever your profession is, except that when you're a scientist, you focus a lot more narrowly on a very specific topic and think about it for a very long time and put a lot more thought into it than people usually do into any problem that they have. If your roof is leaking, you don't know where it's leaking from, you probably don't spend 5 years studying it 10 hours a day.
Right. So it's just that we don't see the steps that go into the process.
Well, they're just much more focused. So he told me that a physicist is like a detective who's trying to use clues to find the answer to something, but it's just ordinary thinking done in extraordinarily focused manner.
Right. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's still a quantitative difference, although it's many orders of magnitude,
but
maybe faster.
I don't think he believed that much in ability differences. But although it's hard to imagine he wouldn't recognize that his was.
Well, I don't know because so one of the quotes that struck me is he says, "You ask me if an ordinary person could ever get to be able to imagine these things like I imagine them. Of course, I was an ordinary person who studied hard. There are no miracle people. It just happens that they get interested in this thing and learn all this stuff, but they're just people."
Right. We had Glick had that quote from Murray Gell-Mann, his colleague at Caltech, who I think maybe was a little jealous of Feynman's.
A little? We should just tell people who he...
Murray Gell-Mann was also a Nobel Prize-winner professor.
Okay,
at Caltech.
but they were the two leading physicists in the world from, I would say the mid-50s till Witten came along, or so, roughly till like the mid-70s, and then they were a little bit older, and they were both at Caltech, and they had offices next to each other, separated by their secretary.
Right.
They had the opposite viewpoint of everything in the world. Murray sought to classify everything and organize and look for mathematical structure, and that was his focus, and he thought physics should be spurred by that desire. And Feynman thought that everything that everything should be practical and see if it works, and whatever is very close to experiment, it comes from your physical reasoning, even if you can't prove it and it doesn't seem to make sense. If it's your intuition, then that should be what you look at. And you can tell the difference just by the way I described them, because we called Murray Murray, and we called Feynman Feynman, or Professor Feynman to his face. You know, some people called him Richard, but it was much more common to refer to him as Feynman. But Murray was just Murray, and he resented that because he wanted to be Sir Murray or something. and they were, you know, roughly, historically, it's hard to say. I would put Feynman above what, Murray is one of the people who's responsible for quarks and all of that. He had in a way more influence than Feynman, because Feynman sat in his room and didn't want to get involved in politics and the field as a whole, and Murray did very much. So anyway, sorry, that was a long introduction to those.
That's good stuff.
But I mean, that was the fame. That was the core of the Caltech physics department at the time. Was them going like sparks coming off, and you know.
Everybody knew that there was some of that tension there, or whatever that.
Oh yeah. You know, that was.
John Horgan tells a funny story about interviewing Murray Gell-Mann in New York, and they were somewhere at a restaurant or something, so they went to get a cab to leave, and Murray said something like, "Well, I don't have any money. You know, can I borrow some money?" And then so he gave him like $25 for the cab, and then Murray wrote him a check and gave it to him and said, "You may not want to cash it because the signature is worth." I don't know if that's true, but John Horgan says that. So in the Gluck book, he's got this little section, in his section on genius itself, a physicist studying quantum field theory with Murray Gell-Mann at the California Institute of Technology in the 1950s, before standard texts had become available, discovers unpublished lecture notes by Richard Feynman circulating samizdat style. He asks Gell-Mann about them. Gell-Mann says, "No, Dick's methods are not the same as the methods used here." The student asks, "Well, what are Feynman's methods?" Gell-Mann leans coyly against the blackboard and says, "Dick's method is this. You write down the problem, you think very hard." He then shuts his eyes and presses his knuckles periodically to his forehead. "Then you write down the answer." You know, and that's that sort of the what I call the myth of genius, that somehow the muse just pops in down from on high like a skyhook and gives you the answer. I call it the Mozart effect, because, you know, Salieri in the movie anyway complains that Mozart is like from the gods, whereas the rest of us have to grind.
Well, you had a very nice, I think it was a chapter in one of your books called The Amadeus Myth.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
so maybe you should...
Yeah, well, that's it. The Amadeus Myth is that we tend to think of the Mozarts or the Feynmans like they're muses from the gods that have been dropped down to us and given us this, you know, super deep wisdom that the rest of us could not have gotten through grinding through the algorithms of how we know stuff. And I think the myth is that, well, that's not the case. It's still a quantitative difference between us and them. It's just that it's so far out there, it feels qualitatively different.
Mozart, for instance, did a lot of hard work and studied other people's work, stole from them, and constantly revised what he did. It wasn't like in the movie at all. And Feynman, was a tremendously hard-working, focused person on what he was interested in doing and driven and passionate about. I think those are the more key elements.
Right, and I think if you read Surely You're Joking, which I love, I think maybe you don't appreciate the hard work.
Right, because
Just seems like
funny stories. Right. And sometimes you get a germ of an idea. Yeah, I think he has this about a plate spinning. That was a good story, and something that you see might give you an idea, and then in the end, people. When the story is told, it seems like the idea was the discovery. But no, the idea was something that set you off in some direction, and you were prepared for that idea by a ton of hard work. And after you get the idea, you do another ton of hard work to get to the answer. And in the end, all people remember is the spinning plate.
Right.
And they go, oh, it's all, like Newton and the apple, or Darwin and the finches. Oh, it was all BS. So read my book.
Well, this is what you have found, right, in your research.
Well, that's what I mean. I was writing that. I thought, speaking of... You pick a topic and you go, I'll write this one really fast. I'll do a history of science because I know that stuff. It's easy. It's not like writing a book on the unconscious mind, which I did, and neuroscience, which I didn't know anything about when I started. And I thought, this would be an easy book, and like 2.5 years later, oh my God, But one of the fun things was to discover all these myths that aren't true, and that, that you can still read about and people learn about in school, and they're all over the internet, and they're all wrong about how people make discoveries.
Right. So there's a certain amount of mythology to it, but we like the myths. It's kind of fun to think of somebody who's that far out there.
People have said to me before, "Oh, why are you against these myths? We like the myths." It's because I'm for truth. It's like, if I wanted mythology, never mind. I'm not going to make a political statement. Sorry.
It's okay. It's the political season. Well, speaking of myths, I mean, your father was one of the great mythbusters, an early skeptic of the, that's the sort of 20th century movement. One of my favorite quotes is on UFOs. From him is, I think it is much more likely that the reports of flying saucers are the results of known irrational characteristics of terrestrial intelligence rather than of the unknown efforts of extraterrestrial intelligences. And that pretty much encapsulates everything we know about UFOs. They're just fraught with human psychology and not extraterrestrial type thing. But with religion, it'd be great if he was alive now, because the whole science and religion thing has exploded mainly because of Dawkins, into this huge culture wars thing. And that wasn't a thing in your, I think.
Why do you say it's exploded because of Dawkins?
Well, I think just the proliferation of books and debates and conferences about science and religion, and science disproving God. So interesting quotes from your dad. An interview for Viewpoint, it doesn't seem to me that this fantastically marvelous universe, this tremendous range of time and space and different kinds of animals, and all the different planets, and all these atoms with all their motions and so on, all this complicated thing can merely be a stage so that God can watch human beings struggle for good and evil, which is the view that religion has. The stage is too big for the drama. I really like that. Mm-hmm. But would he have called himself was he an atheist? Did he call himself an atheist?
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You were going to say, why this is now?
No, I was just going to say that I think that the reason that science and religion are, seem to be coming up against each other is that politicians have used that.
Yes.
And that goes back to the evolution deniers and the global warming deniers, and it's become a big
political
cultural issue because of that. But it doesn't really have to be. And traditionally, science and religion were not against each other, and a lot of the early science was supported by the church, and it's famously also opposed by the church at times. But if you look into the details of that's more political fighting again. It's Galileo. Did the church mind what Galileo was saying? Not so much. They minded more that he was the one who said it, that he was portraying himself as having some truths that they didn't have. So it was more of a political argument. But the church traditionally hasn't been as opposed to science as it is today. And I think hopefully that will eventually go away as well.
Did it come up much at home, the subject?
Not so much. We had, I grew up with a Christmas tree, and we celebrated Christmas, but not in a, religious setting. And then I think when I was about 12 or 13, I kind of wondered, why is it that we don't go to church or temple? What is it that we believe in? And he said, well, you can make your own decision about that. I know what, and I think his problem with it went all the way back to when he was probably around the same age, probably working towards, bar mitzvah, sorry. And he had some trouble with, kind of understanding what was in the text versus natural phenomenon, and he would ask how can you explain this, the burning bush, what exactly, maybe lightning, what, and they kind of shut him down and said you need to just believe, and he said I'm not going to just he couldn't accept it. It was too big a leap of faith. So, but when I was a teenager, he took me to temple and let me see if I wanted to join, and I think was didn't really have
so he didn't have
a bias,
yeah,
right?
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
He almost didn't get into Princeton for graduate school because he was Jewish. They didn't like to take too many Jews, and it was put in writing, I think, in the letter that we don't know about taking Feynman because we don't like to have too many Jews in the department. And then they were convinced that he wasn't that Jewish, and so they ended up taking it. And I guess since he ended up having a Christmas tree, that must have been true too. So.
Yeah.
Right. But his parents were just more culturally Jewish then, rather than sort of religiously Jewish.
Well, I think in Genius, Jim Glick talks about how a year after someone dies, maybe someone here knows, I think the eldest son says a prayer at the grave site, and he kind of insulted his mother because he said he absolutely refused to do it. So I think that there were customs that, even though I think they were fairly observant in that regard. Like, there were things that you just do, and he didn't even want to go along with that.
Right. And even toward the end, I mean, he dealt with cancer for many years,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there was no like backsliding or I'm worried about the future, nothing.
No,
like that.
no.
Yeah. He does have this one quote you included in a series called "The Uncertainty of Values," 1963. I agree that science cannot disprove God. I absolutely agree. I also agree that a belief in science and religion is consistent. I know many scientists who believe in God. It is not my purpose to disprove anything. So that would kind of be fitting.
Yeah, I think he's just sort of to each their own.
But can't science, maybe not disprove God, but certainly show that it's very unlikely? That is to say, the universe should have a certain kind of structure if there is a God that created it. This is like Victor Stanger's argument, that if there is a deity the way we think of it, there should be certain characteristics of the universe that we don't observe. Why? Yeah, why?
Why should, if there is a
Well,
God,
like good design, for example.
why? Well, but now I'm not a religious person, but I grew up like your father, I think, and my understanding is that God's intellect is so much greater by definition than ours that there's no way we could understand what God was thinking, so it's kind of presumptuous to think that we could find certain characteristics of the universe that would have to be true if there was a God.
Okay. But the argument that most believers make, the anthropic principle, the good design, that sort of thing, they use those arguments like, look, but then we have the counter arguments that, well, it's not so good, not so well designed, or that kind of thing.
Well,
In
first of
other
all,
words,
I don't think you shouldn't judge the theory of religion by what some of the people who subscribe to it believe or say, but I think there is a strong argument for God in today's physics. And I don't believe in God, but if I was on that side of what I believed, and we wrote about this in the Grand Design, Stephen Hawking and I, it's the fine-tuning of the universe. So if you look at you can do computer simulations and calculations to show how galaxies or how the universe as a whole or stars would evolve based on the laws that we know of physics, quantum electrodynamics and the standard model of elementary particles and general relativity. And if you take certain parameters in those theories, which are fixed in those theories based on our observations, like the mass of the electron, the charge of the electron, the strength of the strong force, etc., and you tweak them by, some cases, 0.5%, 1%, and then you go through the calculations about what would be the development of the universe. If this were the laws, you would find that just very small perturbations to these parameters mean that we would not be here. And so in that sense, intelligent life or even stars or carbon atoms would not exist. And so based on that, if I was believed that way, and that to me that's strong evidence of some kind of design. It's not a very pretty design. Physicists think it's very ugly, that theory, but maybe God liked it, and maybe God made it that way so that living things could exist.
So why are you not a believer then?
I'm not a believer. Well, I'm not a believer because, like Professor Feynman, when I look around at what the Bible says, I find that most of that stuff doesn't just ring true to me.
Right.
And inside me, I have nothing telling me to believe something where I don't see a lot of evidence. But this fine-tuning has just been talked about more and more over the last 10 years, I would say. And my understanding of why that is not an argument for God is the multiverse, which is the idea that there are many universes with different laws, which arises from many of the modern, in different forms, in the modern theories of cosmology and physics that we have. We haven't designed those theories with the idea of explaining a multiverse, but they just seem to pop out of different approaches to cosmology. And so I believe that the world was a quantum event when it came into existence, and that in these quantum fluctuations, different laws were popping in and out in different universes. And in our in some universes it allowed life, and we were in one of those because it would be a contradiction for us to be in one that didn't allow life, so that explains why the laws are what they are. But
So then just one last thing. So ontologically speaking, are these truly always separate worlds, science and religion? We can never really know if there's a God or not, one way or the other, which seems to be the position your father was taking. We just don't know enough to say. Can't disprove it, can't prove it.
physicists can't prove or disprove anything, right?
Well, so there's...
Sorry. I mean, that's what mathematicians claim to be able to
Yes.
do,
Well,
and they can do that in many cases, but it's also been proved that they can't do that in all cases. So there you go.
There's a great quote in here that your dad has about we're never proving any physics theories. We're just trying to disprove them and the ones that remain standing. So the Popperian falsification principle is do you still follow that as a principle of science? Like we're just
Sure.
yeah.
But maybe you should talk about
Something-
Feynman's approach to string theory. That was interesting in that regard, or maybe I should.
Sure, yeah, you can take that.
He
No,
was-
I mean, just
But
I
I
don't
didn't
mean
think
anything
that, I don't
technical.
think that he believed in it.
Right, that's what I mean.
Okay.
He was because string theory, you may not realize, originated. Well, I don't want to take credit from people, but one of the main people who originated string theory is John Schwartz, who was at Caltech, who's still at Caltech, and he had a junior position back then for many years and wasn't given a professorship and was just in his office doing all this work on his own on string theory, well, with Michael Green in England. and this theory predicted at first at least 26 dimensions. And so Feynman was famous for walking down the halls and yelling it when he sees Schwartz, "How many dimensions are we in today, Schwartz?" And so so he didn't like string theory because, again, it didn't seem to match reality. But, and secretly behind the scenes, a big supporter, though not yet a public supporter of Schwartz, was, whom do you think, based on what I've said earlier? Murray.
come on.
So Murray was supporting Schwartz because there was some beauty in string theory and some symmetry, mathematical beauty that he believed in. So again, they were, at loggerheads. And so that, it just shows, well, and the string theorists, of course, I don't mean to say there's really 26 dimensions and we're stupid, we don't notice that, but they have reasons to, and now it's down many fewer dimensions, but it's still not down to 4. They have their reasons that we don't see them, that they've come up with, that is part of the theory, but he had a hard time accepting that, and he was one of the great skeptics, and most people in those days were skeptics. And of course, it's totally switched today. In physics is still pretty controversial, but in fundamental physics, in the physics of the fundamental forces in elementary particle physics, overwhelmingly people believe in string theory. So if you go outside of that to other physicists who aren't working on string theory, you get a little different of an opinion. But
Well, ultimately, for Feynman's approach to physics, you have to have some experimental evidence, right? Or else you just you withhold
But
judgment.
it's interesting. In one of his greatest contributions, the Feynman diagrams that are pictured on the van outside, when he came up with his path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, which is a new formulation, totally wild and crazy, and his Feynman diagrams, which made calculations 1,000 times easier. Almost literally, because he could do stuff in a half hour on the board that took other people months to do. That stuff he did by going like this, like Murray was saying, and coming up with it. And so people like Niels Bohr and Paul Dirac and many of the great physicists at the time were against it, didn't believe it, and he was given a really hard time when he first presented that work because there wasn't the evidence for it. But since he was not mathematically inclined as much as physically inclined, he would say, well, look, I'm getting the same answers that match the experiments. And okay, I can't explain how it works mathematically, but that's why it works. So that's that divide again. And it was, anybody here heard of Freeman Dyson? Not the vacuum cleaner Dyson. he showed that Feynman's theory works, and so that's really one of the main reasons that people started to accept it, because he did the mathematics after the fact to show why it works or how it works.
Well, but maybe there's a little bit of the hindsight effect here, where now we know that they work, so we look back and go, wow, that was an ingenious.
Yeah, but people were totally against it, right?
Yeah. But maybe for good reason, because other people have crazy ideas that turn out not to be true.
Right,
So
but the
only way
numbers
to
you
know-
got at the end were right.
Yes, that's right. So ultimately, there has to be some.
So if you have a crazy idea and the numbers you get at the end are right, just take it to Caltech and show it to anybody there on the 4th floor in Lauritsen, and they'll be very happy to talk to you. If you have a crazy idea and you don't have that, just forget it.
Your father must have gotten all those theories of everything that people concoct, that Len and I get and other physicists get. You know, amateurs, people that have no training at all. But, you know, over the weekend, they worked out that Newton was wrong and Einstein was wrong and Feynman was wrong. And I got this new theory of, I mean, he must, I think his secretary's name was Helen, right?
Helen,
she must have
yes.
screamed
Helen
out
Tuck.
a lot of the...
She must have screamed
Oh,
a
yeah.
lot.
Well, she screamed
yeah.
me out a lot of times, too.
You had a crazy theory of everything.
I just wanted to talk to him.
But you know what was interesting when I edited the book of letters is how many of those letters he did answer. And just to, you know, it wasn't just letters to colleagues and professors and, you know, academicians. It was to regular people, you know, children and adults with, you know, kind of life-changing questions. How can I'm at a crossroads. What should I do? These sort of questions they would send him.
Really?
And he answered with, you know, with kindness and wit and clarity, and he was just fantastic. But I really didn't think, I mean, I think it really surprised a lot of his colleagues when I published this book, and they said, well, you know, like how many non-technical letters did he write? You know, because I would say, well, it's not technical. I edited, it's not technical. Well, how many could there be?
Yeah.
Well, there's, you know, I mean, I didn't put in all of them.
There was a lot.
There are 12 filing cabinets full of, yeah.
So handwritten.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
typed,
not,
no.
yeah, typed. So back in the day, thank you, it's typewriter with Xerox paper. Or carbon paper. Yes.
You're
even
so
before
young. You're so
Xerox. No, I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Back when this was a phone call, you
Yes.
I remember that.
couldn't walk more than 3 feet from the phone because it was tacked to the wall, right?
We've come so far.
Yeah.
So something in his upbringing or his culture or whatever made him receptive and open to talking to regular people, and because you sort of get the sense from him that he saw himself as sort of a regular person. Like, I want to go play drums or do drawings, or wasn't there a bar in Altadena where he would do sketches? Or
There is a great letter, and I'm not going to remember it enough of it to make it moving to you, but to me it was very moving, and I put it in the book I'm writing now. A former student of his wrote him a letter apologizing that he was now doing some applied physics work.
Oh, yeah.
You know that? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, essentially, and he wrote this really, if there's anything from that in there, you
There
should,
is something,
incredibly
yeah.
moving letter back to this fellow, saying essentially that you totally misunderstood me. I'm sorry if I gave you that impression, and you knew me at a time when I was at a certain point in my career where I was dealing with the biggest questions and the most fundamental questions in physics. But that's not what I think is important. I think what's important is to find a problem that is interesting to you, that you can solve, that you can make a contribution to. And any problem at all is just as important as any other problem.
Right.
And what's important is that you work on it. And then at the end, he somehow segued to, and are a good person and nice to your family.
Right.
And it was such a great letter. And,
Yeah, it was.
it brought tears to my eyes. It's amazing. Just one of his many letters that he wrote to people like that.
well, there's another great quote. I think it's in this book where people ask me, "Am I trying to explain the whole universe?" No, I'm not. I'm just trying to solve one little problem.
Right.
Something like that.
And I have a good Murray story that goes with that. So this is the opposite of Murray. So Murray thought that any physics that isn't elementary particle physics is not worth doing. And so he called, for instance, solid state physics squalid state physics because it was too applied. So, I mean, just again, how they were so diametrically opposed in their approaches to everything, really, right?
Yeah. That's too much. Let's talk a little bit about the Manhattan Project and your father's politics. And you know, it's sort of hard to figure out where he stood, where he would stand today, for example. But he did work on this project mainly as a physics challenge. But ultimately, he also, in some of your quotes, show he supported the idea that we should do this, so the other guys don't do it.
Right. No, and I think that was, and I think also, you know, back to putting ourselves in a different time of the country where people were they were very patriotic, and if feeling like you could do something to help your country was worth doing. So I think when he first heard about the problem, he thought, I'm kind of busy. I don't want to do this. But in the hours after he was told about the idea, he went to the meeting and with this kind of feeling of, well, if there's something I can do, I will. And then I think he became interested in overwhelmingly what's the word? But just sort of life was taken over by trying to consumed with trying to figure this out. And then in the end, towards the end, it stopped being such an issue that Germany would get it first. Everything changed, but they still went ahead because now they're
momentum.
Exactly, the train is moving.
Right.
And I think he expressed regret for that.
Did they feel toward the end that Germany wasn't going to get it first?
I think that was the.
Because I know that what people don't understand is that most physicists in the 1930s, or many physicists, understood that you could make a bomb. People think it was just Einstein's letter and a few people, but when after Fermi did his work, people thought, oh, we could make a bomb out of this, and everyone thought that Heisenberg was the one to do it, and that he was in Germany doing it. As it turned out, he had a stupid approach, and the politics in Germany was really. Well, of course, the politics was bad. I mean, the intellectual politics was bad with the military and getting the proper support from the military and so on. And they had different groups working against each other, so they just didn't do it right. And Heisenberg was misunderstood certain things. But everyone here thought that he was the one, if anyone could do it, he could do it. So I imagine that people, I don't know what your father thought.
Well, and I'm not really sure how much of that is hindsight.
Of what they thought?
And I think my father didn't realize he didn't express any regret during the time, and in fact celebrated with great abandon when it went off, and didn't really. It took him a while to sort of realize what they had done,
right,
and the cost of it, and that to even think that maybe even though you could have done it, doesn't mean that you should have done it. So, I mean, he didn't, getting back to your question, he didn't really participate too much politically, but in, I think early 82, oh yeah, you were probably here. 82, he spoke out in favor of a nuclear freeze.
Right. There was I have in my study a New York Times full-page ad. And it says 1,500 American physicists against nuclear war. I think it was from maybe 81 or 82. And I'm proud that I'm on it. But yeah, he's on that. Yeah, protesting nuclear war. Protesting the nuclear arms race.
Yes, and the testing, the above ground testing, and all that. I think.
Yeah, it was just.
Well,
it wasn't
like
a whole.
Nuclear...
I don't think there was a whole manifesto there. It was just against. Nuclear arms.
But there's some quote you have in there about I can't tell if the politician's decision to up the arms race as a mutual assured destruction kind of strategy works or not. I don't know. He says. It's almost like he wanted to stay out a little bit out of politics.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. In fact, the rare occasions that he found himself involved, the Challenger Commission and the early 60s, he was involved in, it's not exactly politics, but he did evaluating textbooks for the state of California. And I mean, it became incredibly charged politically, but the Challenger thing was kind of such an anomaly that it's unique in the fact that he put aside his own work. Really, at the end of his life, he already wasn't 100% physically, knew that he was probably not going to have a lot longer, and put kind of everything on hold and went to Washington.
Did you like the film that was made last year about that? Was it William Hurt played?
Oh, right.
Your father?
Yeah, I thought what really struck me about that is that was filmed in South Africa.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
and I thought it looked. I mean, I
Yeah.
thought, well, that'll never work, but it totally did. So I thought there were a lot of.
They showed it at his home, like in the bedroom or
Yeah.
wherever. The Nobel Prize is like hanging right there. My guess is he
No,
didn't
that
have
was-
it displayed
that,
on his heart.
No, right.
I would have been surprised, yeah, if he had, 'cause
It was in his sock drawer.
So
that sounds right. Yeah. From the Feynman I knew, right?
where is the Nobel Prize now? You have it, right?
I do.
Oh,
It's in
sweet.
the.
I should have asked you to bring it today. Tom.
Yeah, it's safe deposit box.
It's in the sock. No, not the
No,
sock drawer.
safe deposit box now.
So
Gotta
sitting
be careful in Altadena.
That's right. Yes, yeah. So just like what was dinner like? The dinner table like with your dad? I mean, people complain, politics or religion or whatever. Or is it just physics, or is it just what you do at school today? Or
Yeah, it was kind of what we do at school, and then he liked to. I don't know why, but he liked to talk about things that he had done wrong. I don't know, kind of play the fool a little bit. Talk about, he left his sweater somewhere, or he had a, complete conversation with someone and then realized, no idea who that was, and just sort of these funny stories that, and my mother would look over at him and say, oh, Richard, and, and like the same tone of voice she used when she talked to my brother or to me. And so it really, he kind of felt like one of the kids. He didn't drink, and so when there was a period in his life, but way before me, when he did. And so he would go to a party, and people would say, well, what do you want, what are you going to have to drink? Oh, I'll have what the kids are going to have, and he took, actually coming up here sort of reminds me, I went to Noyes, what was Noyes Elementary, it's now Avison, and he would drive carpool. And he had, he was just such a master. He would go, and we sort of vaguely knew, we were young, but we weren't idiots, we knew kind of how to get to school. And he would turn, if it was supposed to turn left, he would turn right, and we would all say, no, and he would kind of take us on these little wild goose chase, like Mr. Feynman's wild ride, and somehow we'd pull up just on time every time. But it was like a white knuckle kind of like, are we going to get there? Is it going to be okay? Lost in Altadena. It just, he liked having fun with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What are some of your other favorite quotes and stories that you had?
Let's see. Yeah. I think this sort of speaks to his humility. He says, after all, I was born not knowing and have had only a little time to change that here and there.
Yeah, that's a beautiful quote.
Yeah,
There's a sense of humility about him.
most definitely.
And also about the Nobel Prize. Who wants the prize? The prize is knowing, finding out. But of course, he went there and got the prize anyway.
Sure. Well, he did ask a reporter very early on, do you think I can get away with not accepting it? And the guy's response was pretty much, dude, that's actually worse, like that's a bigger statement
Right.
to say I'm not going to accept it.
Right.
And so I think it was just sort of easier
Right.
to. But, he really did kind of, the letters that people wrote to him saying, well, you as the Nobel Prize winner, I'd love your opinion. Those kind of
Right.
irked him.
Yes.
Like,
On matters of whatever. That he
of
doesn't
whatever,
have-
right.
Yeah, why is that Nobel Prize winners always get asked for like economic policy, war, politics?
I don't know. David Politzer complained about that a lot. I
yeah.
don't think he went to get his, but
But it's back to this genius muse thing. Like these people are so smart
yeah.
that they must know about everything.
First
Right.
of all, if they want to ask a physicist, they probably only know one now, or two with Einstein, right?
Right, yeah.
So-
Yeah. Well, here it is. I don't like honors. I appreciate it for the work I did, and I know there's a lot of physicists who use my work. I don't need anything else. I don't think there's any sense to anything else. I don't see it makes any point that someone in the Swedish Academy decides that this work is noble enough to receive a prize. I already got the prize. The prize is the pleasure of finding things out. That's such a great title.
Yeah.
So, what else?
Oh, I was thinking, this one just makes me laugh. You cannot define anything precisely. If we attempt to, we get into that paralysis of thought that comes to philosophers.
I was going to say, it sounds like his thoughts on philosophy.
Who sit opposite each other, one saying to the other, "You don't know what you were talking about." The second one says, "What do you mean by no?" "What do you mean by talking?" "What do you mean by you?" And so on.
He did complain about philosophy, or however he said it with a Z. And yet, when you watch his lectures online, by the way, Feynman has quite the digital footprint.
He does.
It's
Yes, he
huge.
does.
There's thousands of videos of him, and a lot of them he does talk about sort of philosophy of physical sciences. The opening seminar at the Salon Institute in Big Sur.
Yeah.
He says, "Well, is everybody here? I see that there's somebody who's not here.
Right.
How can you know that there's not somebody here?"
Right.
Really, that's kind of philosophy.
Sure.
In a way. So he did
Right.
it. He disparaged pure philosophy, I think, but did a lot of it on his own.
Right.
In a narrow
Sense,
sense.
yeah, not real.
Well, one of his best books was The Character of Physical Law, which we could argue is a book of science, philosophy of science, but he's kind of explaining how science works, not as he would have put it, making dozens of pointless definitions and then having impossible to understand discussions about those definitions in which you come to no conclusion. That's
Right.
not the kind. That's not the kind of book that
Right.
was.
Right.
Well, that book came from the lectures.
The lectures,
the
right,
messenger
yeah.
lectures. And actually, you can all, thanks to Bill Gates, you can all watch those online.
Oh wow, really? Okay. I have to-
Project-
when I
Project
was an
Tuva.
undergrad, I'd love that. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
All
What's
right.
it? Wait, say it again. What's it?
So Bill Gates hosts a website. Project Tuva is the name of it, and he bought the messenger lectures so that everyone can watch them.
You should tell the Tuva story.
Okay.
Yes, we'll transition to talking
Oh,
about the
okay.
van and the Feynman diagrams and all that. But you'll see on the back of the van it says Tuva or bust. What's the story there?
All right. So when my father was a young nerdy boy, he collected stamps and was fascinated by the Tuva stamp because it was triangular, and he looked it up on the map, and he discovered that it was in the middle of it was an independent country in the middle of the Soviet bloc. And he thought, what is that like? How I would like to, and I think he thought at that point it would be fun, or imagined traveling there. And then many years later, his friend Ralph Layton was over at our house for dinner, and they were playing kind of a geography game, and Ralph was known to kind of stump my dad, and so he mentioned Tuva, and my father knew what that was and knew where it was, and but they didn't know. They went to the World Book and looked it up right away, and discovered that it had a
World Book.
World Book Encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia. Yeah, back before Google. That's what people did.
That's what they did, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you type in Tuva on Google, you'll get a musical instrument, I think.
So it actually might have been the Encyclopedia Britannica, now that I'm thinking about it. But we had both. We were big users of the encyclopedia. And they discovered that the capital was Kyzyl and Kazil, and they thought, okay, like,
We gotta go.
we got to go. Like a place without a vowel, and that alone is worth going. So so he decided they were going to go, and they had this idea that I think it probably would have been easy for my father to call up and make a few phone calls, see what you can do, get me in. But he wanted to go as a normal guy. And so they had all these ideas of, writing. I mean, they wrote letters. They were like pen pals with some random guy in Tuva, and it was a very awkward thing. They didn't have a Tuva to English dictionary. They had a Russian to Tuvan, so they had to go English to Russian to Tuvan. And the structure of the sentences, grammatically, they had to kind of wrap their head around. It was quite an adventure, and I think when he died, not actually realizing his dream, I think we were all sad about that because the day or two later after he died, he received the official invitation to go. But I think, now
Did Ralph make it?
Ralph made it. I've actually been.
You've been there? Okay.
And I think really what was important to my father was, he was having a hell of a time on the journey getting there. And I think, I'm sure he would have loved it, but he had a good time.
And the throat singers have come here to LA.
The throat singers have come here, and they started this whole thing. They got on the board of the LA County, I think it was LA County Museum, and they had a gala, and they sort of had this exchange, this visit. So they brought some antiquities, and all so that they could be bigwigs on the. I think it was okay if he was an art bigwig rather than a physics bigwig, so you had just these kind of fanciful ideas. It was years that they thought about going there.
Well, this van that we have parked outside here, there's a picture of you online I found as a little girl with the whole family standing. So you remember this van when you were, is this what you got driven to school in?
It's, so the carpool story, that's not in the van. That's, that was mostly in his small car. So we had the full effect of like being thrown from side to side. But the van was something we bought when I was early, like first or second grade, and because we like to go camping as a family and go into the middle of nowhere, and sometimes it rains, and so they thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a van that we could all sleep in and be kind of this self-contained unit? And if you imagine you're driving down the road and you take a right, and then maybe there's a fork in the road, and one road's kind of dusty and maybe not so good, and the other one's a little bit paved. Well, you take the dusty one, and then you get to another choice, and you take that one, the one that looks the worst, and you do that often enough, and you find yourself in the middle of nowhere. So we did that a lot in that van.
This is like in Northern California?
Just anywhere, the desert.
Yeah. And did people ever stop you and say, how come you have Feynman diagrams on your...
No.
I'm sure they all recognize those, right?
Well, my brother tells a story. I don't remember that. But yes, he remembers that someone said, why do you have Feynman diagrams? And maybe my mother said, because we're the Feynmans. But I remember more like, that's a kind of hippie diagram. What is
like
that?
A peace symbol or
Yeah,
something,
right.
yeah.
It was some kind of weird, and this was actually kind of the first car I drove. And at a certain point when you're 16, you're not going to be fussy. Like, does it run? Great, I'll drive it.
So your first driving experience was in a 1976 Dodge cargo van. Oh boy. 74. Well, when we started the Skeptics in 92, one of our first speakers was John Gribben, who's a physicist from England, who's also a science writer, and he was coming to America to tour for one of his books. It was Schrodinger's Cat book. And so we said, okay, we'll have him at Caltech, but what he wanted for his honorarium was he wanted to see Feynman's van. Well, I don't know where it is, but anyway, so I called Ralph, and I think it's at a gas station in Monrovia. I'm like, okay, so at the time I was driving a Ford van with a cassette player. You remember cassettes, and I had the Feynman drumming on a audio cassette. So Gribben and I are driving down the 210 freeway, listening to Feynman drumming, and I'm on my brick phone talking to Ralph, going, okay, where do I get off? Get off at Mountain. So we get off at Mountain, and we go, okay, go right on. I think it's right on Foothill, maybe. I think there's a 76 station. Is there a 76 station there? Yep, there it is. And so we drive around the back, and there's the van parked behind the back, weeds growing through in the wheel well, and it was really in bad shape. And then a few years later, I took Edward Tufte to see it, and by then it was in Palos Verdes, in some guy's garage, and who was a book dealer, I think yeah. And then the next time that the van was rescued by Seamus Blackey, I just want to introduce Seamus. If you could stand up and say hi to everybody, Seamus. Seamus is the man who restored the van, and Seamus is a particle physicist himself who had a budding career going, and he was going to work at the SSC in Texas until Congress determined that, what do we need that for?
First they spent $1 billion,
Yeah,
right?
after the $1 billion. So then Seamus moved into working in the video games industry and worked for Microsoft on the Xbox, and then and now restores video games and cars, and he's right here in South Pasadena where the van is carefully protected. So Seamus, I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your connection with the van and the diagrams and how you came to restore the van.
All right, cool. Thanks for having me here. I wanted to say that the great thing about the van is that you always have the lowest fuel economy vehicle at any gathering. But no, it's the van. I think it's a uniquely American and uniquely Californian and uniquely Feynman kind of object that represents, I think, the influences that drew me into physics. When I was in high school, the Surely You're Joking book came out, and for a minute, suddenly, a lot of guys in my generation of physics got this insight that physics was not what we thought, and you could do something great and have a fun time doing something very, very difficult. And it drew so many people I knew and inspired so many people to know just about, your dad's existence. And so when I discovered, I think from you, that the van was around Pasadena, and I looked at myself as a particle physics guy who collects cars and restores old stuff, I felt this kind of bizarre fiduciary responsibility to seek out this sacred totem in the book repository and bring it home. And I remember this moment when it arrived. I got the Beverly Hills car restoration guys, and they sent the fancy truck, and it brought it, and it showed up at my lab, and then there it was, and the guy tilted the flatbed down, and he said, "Okay, well, so get in and you drive it down." I'm like, I'm not getting in Feynman's seat. I can't be in Feynman's seat, but it all turned out well. But I think that I spent a lot of time hiring young engineers and scientists, and I've noticed something that's changed. The idol that guys in their 20s have now are people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and they're fine, but they're business guys. People are looking to, I'll have a website and I'll quickly make a lot of money. And the type of inspiration that Feynman represents, I think, is more important now than it ever has been. And so for that reason, I think it's worth a lot of effort. Well, the idea of doing something to be useful to solve a problem, the pleasure of finding things out, the idea that there is more to the universe than just the stuff on the internet through your mobile phone, that there's something bigger and more important and more beautiful that you can see just by opening your eyes and looking and studying a little bit. That idea is really, really important. I think it's going to become more important with time. And I think that's why it's worth putting effort into things like the van and the books and thinking about these issues and celebrating.
How did you restore it? Is it the original diagram paint, or did they paint over it?
Oh, God. So this is amongst people who restore cars, this is an issue, like science and religion or any of the other easy topics you've brought up. I don't know why you guys didn't go into global warming earlier, because you're all warmed up. Yeah, no, we could string theory, like all of it. You could hit it all. But no, there are schools of thought about restoration versus preservation, and so we decided on preservation. And for Michelle, this has to be totally bizarre that you have 5 guys looking at the paint of the van that she was embarrassed to drive to school in. But we had 5 guys looking at the paint and saying, well, I don't know. We could cover it. Or we could get a guy to exactly reproduce it, or we could just buff it. We could deoxidize it. And so we ended up preserving it so that it looked, just like the really cheap pinstriping job that it was, to be frank, yeah.
And why is that van not at part of Caltech or the Smithsonian, or what would it take to get it?
It's an excellent question. So the plug that you're conveniently handing me here, which is great, is we have a petition on change.org to get the Feynman van into the Smithsonian. We're looking for financing. The Smithsonian is a terrific institution. They are cash-strapped, like all great government institutions. And I say that with full irony, but no, it deserves to be somewhere where a lot of people can see it and wonder what it is, because it is a really unique thing. It's this van, it's this ugly brown van with these weird diagrams on it, but it has this tremendous story, and it's really easy to tell the story about Feynman and then segue that into a story about science and physics and why this is important and what we learned about the universe and how. it's very easy to tell that story around the van, and it's an important item for that reason. So I think it deserves to be somewhere, at least like the Peterson Automotive Museum downtown here, but in a place where people can actually see it. So that's really what we're working toward as quickly as is possible to work toward.
I think I remember you saying something about to get something into Smithsonian, they want like X number of dollars donated for square feet that the thing is going to take up or something like that.
Is that how it works?
Yeah. Yeah, it turns out that
Oh
money
my.
is important in this. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, but no, that's how it goes. They have a budget, and they have to, maintain all of the stuff, and they have the situation in which they have to maintain certain standards of preservation of the things that are in the institution.
So I could, like, for a
Against
few
the budget.
grand, I could give them a few of my books on the table and they'll put it in the Smithsonian. Why not? I'd do it.
Well, the sort of maintenance they provide may not be sufficient for you, but we can see.
There must be some admission
Every once in a
criteria.
while, they'd wax you.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just tell us, like, when we go out there after, we're going to take a few questions from the audience and then wine time, and get your pictures taken with the van and all that. What diagrams are those? What are they explaining?
Oh, well, we could have a little quiz is what we could do. We could go around and we could talk about them. They're actually pretty interesting. They're the ones he chose. I don't know if you guys who know Feynman diagrams, if you look at them, there's an interesting set of choices. And the one on the back is particularly interesting given when he had it drawn and what people knew and what he drew that he thought it was. So we can talk about that when we're over there.
And since, Len, you featured this on your cover, maybe you could just, like, what do the squiggly lines mean versus the arrows?
Those are exchange of photons. So the lines with the arrows, there's two electrons that scatter off each other. So electron coming in and going like this and continuing, and another electron like that. And in physics, since Feynman, the interactions are thought of as, well, it's a force, but we think of it as exchange of virtual particles. And so these squiggly lines are photons. And anyway, to Feynman, to a physicist,
Let me give it a shot. These theories are so hard.
But
You can't actually solve them. You solve them by approximating them successively more accurately. Okay, so you get this terrific infinite number of terms that have all this crap and constants and stuff in them, right? And I think at some point Feynman said, wait a second, each one of these has a characteristic that I could think of as being something going in and something coming out. So I'll make a drawing, something coming in, something coming out, and then there's an easy relationship you can see between the vertices, where stuff interacts with it, and the type of term that would be in that approximation. And that's why he said earlier that you could sit at a blackboard and just intuitively draw all of the numbers of vertices and things going in and out, and you kind of know you have all of the terms. It would be really hard to look at mathematically.
But beyond
and figure
that,
out.
these represent mathematical quantities. So people used to sit there and do all the mathematics. And yes, he noticed that when you're doing that mathematics, there's certain regularities, and that they can be interpreted as things coming. Obviously, things are coming in. When you do an experiment in particle physics, it's always collision. So you shoot things at each other, and you look at what happens, what comes out, the momenta, and so forth, and which direction they're going in, and all that. And what he noticed was that these iterative calculations that you do, which you get a number of terms, successively more complicated terms, actually can be represented by diagrams like this and interpreted as particles coming in and exchanging other particles. So this, for instance, this is exchanging 4 photons. There's a simpler one where you exchange 1 photon, 2 photons, 3 photons. And there's all kinds of other more complicated ones. But what he noticed was that you could associate to each of these squiggles and lines and vertices a mathematical expression. So you didn't have to derive these mathematical expressions the old way. You could draw all the diagrams of how things could collide and exchange things. And from that, you could look at it and put, oh, with the squiggle goes this, with the vertex goes that. And you'd get yourself the equation that you wanted without doing the math. And so that was a tremendous simplification.
No, but I think that's, in a way, the tool is, it lets you think like Feynman for a minute.
Yeah.
Because you get to draw some pictures and have this intuition about it, and it gives you the answer. And suddenly, for a second,
yeah, but I mean, what's
you're like
really
Feynman.
deep about it is that before this, you may have heard the term, because it's used culturally, virtual particles or virtual, and people didn't think in those terms. This comes from these diagrams, because these things that are exchanged are never observed. What's observed are these things on the outside, and what's going on are these quantum processes that are happening in this kind of cauldron, as they call it, bubbling space-time and blah, 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 that you never observe, but that cause the effects on these things that are on the outside. And so this picture of particles interacting by exchanging other particles that you don't observe is completely due to this method that he invented of how we draw the pictures to represent the math. And so it totally changed not only the way we do calculations, but the way physicists think about the interactions and forces. So
I love that the cover of her book, that's a particularly unfriendly term. That
yeah, that is an unfriendly
That's
term.
pretty yucky.
There's other terms in here too. Anyway, each chapter has one of them, so that's another one. And you'll see a whole bunch on the van, but you know, they look like doodles. But so here's interesting. So a photon comes, and its energy you can spontaneously decay into an electron and a positron because they're antiparticles. So the photon is a certain amount of energy, and it creates an electron and a positron. They're going off here, and here they're exchanging another photon, and so forth. So whatever interaction among particles that you can imagine can be drawn in these diagrams. And to do an actual calculation, you get an infinite number of them that you have to sum up. Luckily, we can ignore most of them and just use a few of them to get pretty good answers, like the 10 or 12 decimal places.
So afterwards, people can talk to you about how to support the Feynman Van project.
Please do.
Yeah, please do.
I'll have a can ready for your donation.
Let's go ahead and turn it open for a few minutes of questions. We'd like to chime in. Yes, sir.
I heard a story a few days ago that looked like in the LHC, someone discovered a new particle. Can you guys analyze?
Yeah, but they don't know yet. Yeah, there's some sign that there may be something that could be a heavier version of a heavier Higgs, but you have to have patience. So more data needs to come in. Yeah, sorry? It would be a big thing. It would be a really, really big thing. In fact, discovering the Higgs wasn't such a big thing for physicists because everyone kind of thought it would be the same.
Anything like it could be a fermion, it could be a boson, and right now it's so little information.
Well, I'm not sure. I assume that if they do know, it would be a boson because they're speculating it might be another kind of a Higgs. It would be great if it would be a supersymmetric particle. It would be interesting if it were, but...
See, Seamus, we should have stuck with the Texas project. Now it's just a
well,
hole in
no,
the
we
ground.
should have stuck with Texas for sure. Right. Oh,
Don't even go there.
don't even go there. Yeah. There's a quote from Congress was grilling way back. I think this was Jimmy Carter's. And I'm going to get the story a little wrong. You probably remember it. Jimmy Carter's science advisor, and they're talking about building this new accelerator to study physics and so on. And they said, what is this new machine, this new physics installation, going to do to further the defense of our country? And the guy said, it's going to make it worth defending. So I like that, but we canceled the SSC anyway. So
One little thing, is that particle, can you something like use the Feynman diagrams to tell something about that particle? Or?
yeah, everything that they calculate for these collisions of particles come from Feynman diagrams. Everything. Yeah, and if you pick a paper in particle, either in string theory, you're going to see Feynman. There's just like saying let's not use numbers.
Past that, whole techniques in computing exist because people were trying to compute Feynman against the computer, and they thought of new ways to use syntax in computing problems.
And by the way, the path integrals that he got the Feynman diagrams to kind of explain it. It was totally illegal, non-kosher mathematics that didn't make any sense. Illegal mathematics that started, illegal to mathematicians. Yeah. So they send the math police at you. But the math police got turned away because they realized that a whole new field has come up in mathematics based on that idea of the path integrals. So.
Barry.
Yeah, I was just wondering to get your idea on how much of genius is being born in the right time and the right place. I mean, if someone as Feynman's intellect had been born in a rural agricultural society, would we have ever heard of it? The follow-up is how many people actually, with his intellect, were actually born into a rural agriculture?
Yeah, this is a really good question because so there's 6.9 billion more than there were in Shakespeare's time. Say, where are all the Shakespeares out of that huge gene pool we have? And so maybe it could only happen once.
How many poets are there now compared to back then? Probably the same number or fewer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, so if Feynman hadn't discovered Feynman diagrams, would somebody else have figured this out as a tool?
That's a hard one. I don't know.
Yeah.
Some things you can look at and say for sure.
Like relativity, this would have been figured out.
Yeah, certainly special relativity and. Yeah, eventually probably general. It depends whether you think there's another theory that would be.
I mean, in the Upright Thinkers, you talk about Wallace and Darwin, and the simultaneous invention and discovery.
Right. So sometimes there are things that are quote in the air, which means that there are things that have been discovered that lead toward that, and these are the first people to put that together. And sometimes there are things that are like out of left field that seem, and I mean, I think Feynman diagrams is one of them, and path integrals may also be.
Yeah.
Even though so Feynman invented this whole theory of path integrals, which revolutionized physics and also is a new field of mathematics and is used in statistical physics and all over the place, right? Based on a remark that another really smart guy named Dirac in the late 20s or early 30s made this one remark in one of his papers that, here's an interesting thing in quantum mechanics that reminds me of something in classical physics, but only for short times they seem to be the same. And Feynman took that remark and that one remark and made it into a whole multiple fields of physics and mathematics by just going to see what that really means and taking it farther. It's actually amazing.
I'm just giving you the final word before we break for wine and stuff. I guess the general principle seems to be just the curious character, just open to turning left instead of right.
That's right. Yeah.
And where that can lead.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something any of us could do? Should I start turning left instead of?
Well, and I think Seamus makes a really good point that that we are all kind of so focused on looking at our phones and kind of just figuring out what we need to know right in front of us, that maybe we need to sort of remove the blinders and look around a little more and take the road less traveled occasionally, and I'll bring it back to my grandfather, because I think he was the one that started this with walks with his son, and where they looked at the wagon and they looked at birds, and they didn't know, the other mothers said, you see, he's walking with his son, you should do that too. So they went out and they walked, and then at school, they were all talking about that the other boys knew the names of all the birds, and so I think my father came back and sort of reported, and his father said, it doesn't. That we could learn that, but
Right.
but what's important is that we looked at the way they're behaving, and I think he was fascinated by the natural world, and he had the tools. I mean, there's a really great quote, but you'll all get the book, so you'll get to read them. But he speaks kind of reverently and poetically about math, and I hadn't really even looked at it in those terms, and so he's definitely has sort of the technique and ability to see things in that sense as well. But for us, people who don't have that, we can certainly appreciate the natural world.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for coming. And you had one more question?
Curious minds want to know about your shoes, Michael.
Oh my God. My shoes are from.
Is that a Feynman diagram?
Those are Feynman shoes. Yes. I get my shoes from Europe now in Cologne, Germany. Basically, the way I do my shopping is I hold something up, and my wife Jennifer goes, and that's how I know I've gotten the right thing.
At least you're not to
Anyway.
the point yet where she holds it up.
Yeah, that's right.
Enough of an answer.
Anyway, thank you for coming, and we'll continue the conversation now for the next couple hours. Take a look at the band. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Seamus. Thank you.